Well, this is a fun lesson. It's all about Giotto, and we get to kind of look into, analyze all the things that set him apart as an artist and made him so famous in his day and even famous in our day. He really did do a lot to bring us forward from the Byzantine style into a more realistic style that headed right into the Renaissance, where we get a lot of painters like Michelangelo going back to his Scrovegni, or sometimes it's called the Arena Chapel. But Michelangelo would go there and study Giotto's works because he really was moving things forward. And it's interesting to see the heights that he attained in the drawing that he did, the more individual faces, the clothing looks more real, the draperies hanging off the people better. He started incorporating natural landscapes in the background rather than just the gold to make it seem so celestial. And he started to really bring things down to earth, and so his figures got smaller, and Mary and Jesus were the same size as everybody else, and you can really see how he starts making a more human connection between us and the deity, the figures of deity that he painted. So it's interesting also to see how they tried to conserve paint back then, and I certainly don't fault Giotto. I don't want to get into the habit of faulting some of our great historical figures like some people do. I don't really want to do that in any way, so I'm not faulting Giotto. It's totally understandable. He had a budget, it was limited. Lapis lazuli is a very expensive semi-precious stone that was ground up and used as a pigment, and it made the pigment extremely expensive. And so in a way to save money, they were trying to, they did it as secco fresco instead of bone fresco, which means essentially instead of dyeing the plaster, he just painted on top of the plaster after it was already dry, and unfortunately over time that meant that it was less permanent and it did flake off. So you'll see that in the video. You'll see how you're kind of missing the blue robe that would have been there, and you can see it in several other places of Giotto's work where the blue it just isn't there. The lapis lazuli paint just came right off. So it's kind of disappointing from our perspective, although from his perspective I'm sure it looked fine and it looked just as good as the rest of the frescoes. But I think it's interesting to relate that to our lives, in that some areas we might be tempted to cut corners or perhaps skip a step, or maybe not do it quite as permanent, as quite as perfectly as we know that we should. And yet it's not necessarily the end of us, but it will show up over time. So we need to be careful, the same as Giotto could have been a little bit more careful. We need to be careful about the choices that we make and how they're going to become over time magnified if we make them habits. And I also want to point out that Giotto's considered kind of having achieved perfection in his day. He was really, really admired and looked up to. And I want to talk a little bit about that perfection. What is it that makes someone perfect? If we go from, is perfection the being on the right road, on the way to being whole, or is it already having attained wholeness? So we're going to look at some Hebrew words that are used in Scripture. There are men who were living, such as Job, for example, who were called perfect in Scripture. And that was before Job's trials. So what kind of perfection was that? Was it the perfection, is it perfection to be working on our way and having good hearts and doing the best that we can? Or do we have to obtain full perfection? Obviously we can't do that kind of eternal perfection in this life. So this lesson talks about a couple different kinds of perfection, both those that are mentioned in Scripture and also by Elder McConkie, and it gives us a little hope that we actually can attain some degree of perfection in this life, and to help us to see that we really can't afford to take shortcuts here and there hoping they won't show up, because they will in our habits, and over time they will be magnified. So if we do our best every day and we're covered by the atonement, I firmly believe that we can achieve mortal perfection in this life. Not eternal perfection like God has, but mortal perfection we can achieve in this life. Today, right now, the here and now, you can do it. So it's a fun lesson for me. This is a big one for me, at least the perfection issue, and I really had a lot of fun seeing how that related with Giotto and him being called perfect in his day. So I hope you enjoyed this lesson.